Psychologists talk about the space around you, that all of us have what is sometimes referred to as our personal space. Maybe you've heard it talked about. And some will draw like a bubble around someone to illustrate that the space around you is kind of like a bubble. And if someone violates that space, gets into that space, it makes us back up and like, who is this person that's... I've watched people back each other down the hallway when you're talking to a close talker. You know that. Or a stranger will reach into that space and touch you or try to give you like a bro hug. And you're like, no, stay away. But we all are familiar with that space. I think every human being that's ever born, you grow up with the center of gravity in this world is just around you. It's your space, and life pretty much is just about you, just about me. That's how we all live for quite a while. I see it most clearly, I think, in college students. I was a college pastor for a long time, and I would go into guys' dorm rooms just to hang out, and they all looked the same. They were a mess. There were socks and towels on the floor that hadn't been picked up in weeks. The beds were never made. It smelled like a junior high locker room in there. Every college guy's dorm room. Because first of all, I'll see some of them in sleeping bags, and I go, why are you in a sleeping bag? They say, well, Palmer, if I use sheets, I have to wash them. All right, well, that'll fix everything right there. Use a sleeping bag. But when you're in a college dorm room, you can just live for you and nobody else. But then this happens. Sometimes in life, you meet somebody else. And when you meet that other person, all of a sudden your heart stops to beat. And you can't think about anything else except them. You can't even eat a meal because your stomach is in knots. And then when you see them, you feel like an electrical current has just run through your body. But this other person, they have their story. They have their space, their own space. And they have their own history, and they have their background and their abilities and their giftedness. And they have stuff like cats, things like that. And then after you've known them, you get this desire that you want your space, my space, and their space to come together as one. And in our culture, you have to do something in order for that to happen. It's called a proposal. And I remember after being a college roommate with my twin brother for like 3 years, I was done. And I'd met this girl named Veronica, and I thought she'd be much better to live with than my twin brother. And so I had known her for a year, and I was in love. And so finally, I got the courage to buy a ring. So I went down to Wells Fargo, cleaned out my bank account, literally closed the account, went to a jewelry store, bought a ring, and then asked her to go out. And I showed up at her apartment with flowers. And as I'm knocking on the door, I'm shaking and I'm sweating. I had malaria. I had just come back from Africa, seriously. So that afternoon, I'd been so sick with malaria. You think it's nerves. It wasn't nerves. I could take it, I think. It could have been nerves. It really could have been nerves. And she answers the door, and I'm just sweating like I'd been working out or something. And I'm pale, and she says, "What's wrong with you?" I said, "Man, I've got malaria." And I says, "But come on, we're going out." And because I had this great plan to take her out for a steak dinner down in Huntington Beach, and then take her out on the Huntington Pier and walk out to the end of the pier in the Atlantic, or no, wait, it's Pacific, and kneel down and propose. That was my plan. She says, "We can't go out. You look like you're going to die." And she said, "Come lay on the couch and let me take care of you." And I was like, "Okay, but first, hang on, I got to do something." So all sweaty and shaky from the chills, I dropped down on one knee. This is in some apartment on Imperial Avenue in La Habra, and I proposed. It was the least romantic proposal, but she said yes. It was just God, and she said yes. We've been married for a long, long time. We just had our anniversary last week, 32 years. And... But what I was saying is, first there was your space, my space, and then there is their space, her space, and then they come together, and something very divine happens. Marriage is God's idea. Today I want to talk about this idea of the space between us, this space that we're in together. And the Bible and God always talk about it as marriage. And maybe you're here today and you're not married. Maybe you're single. Maybe you've been married, but now you're not. I want to say, but this message is still for you. These principles apply to so much of life. And maybe right now you're not ready to be married and you don't feel like that's God's calling on your life. And that's okay. I still think these principles apply to all of us today as we read what Jesus has to say in the Sermon on the Mount. So open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. And I want to share this key idea with you first, and it's this, that, and I hope this thought goes home with you, that Jesus champions marriage in his kingdom. We're going through this series, Kingdom Living, and in the kingdom of heaven on earth, Jesus lifts up marriage. He raises the bar on it, and he says, protect your marriage, treasure it, keep it holy, and keep it sacred. So let's read verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than the whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for the whole body to go into hell. So this seems like a very aggressive passage, isn't it? This Sermon on the Mount, it's almost poetic. You start with the Beatitudes, and they're beautiful, and it ends with the Lord's Prayer, and that's stunning. But in between, Jesus pauses, and he gets in our grill, he gets in our kitchens, and he gets pretty aggressive, and he says, be very careful how you treat the people around you who you love. Be very careful because something as simple as lust can really mess it up. This thing that God made to be good and beautiful is sacred and can be damaged very easily. In Genesis chapter 24, and Jesus quotes this later in Mark chapter 10, we read, a man will leave his father and his mother, and he will cling to his wife, and they will become one flesh. There's something very profound. When you read this verse, there's something extremely profound happening because she has her world and you have your world, and then you come together as one. You had your own space and she had hers, but then me becomes we and I becomes us. And the thing is, you don't lose your identity. You don't lose the special, great, incredible person God made you to be. But now you have this brand new space together that God is in the middle of. And there's an epic shift in your heart from a life just focused on you and who you are to a life that's focused on us. And all of a sudden, you become a person who cares more about their issues and their problems and their needs than you could care about your own needs. And all of a sudden, the center of attention of life is not just me, but it's her, or it's the other person God has put in your life. The husband or the wife. So what does Jesus say about this sacred space between? He says, I want to say first that he says the space between is fragile. It's very easy to mess up a marriage. Let's go back to where we're reading Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Man, that seems pretty harsh. But what Jesus is saying is that the space between, it's very delicate, it's very fragile, and even something as small as lust can start to mess it up. I've been using this illustration of a bubble, right? And if you've ever made soap bubbles with your kids, or when you were a kid, if you made soap bubbles are extremely fragile. You just touch them, let alone poke them like a balloon, and they will burst. In a way, Jesus is saying marriages are like that. When I was thinking about this metaphor of bubble, I couldn't get out of my mind this movie that I saw back in junior high. It's titled The Boy in a Plastic Bubble. Anyone else remember seeing that? All right, so I'm not alone here. And it was John Travolta's, I think it was his first movie. And it was terrible. But but you have this really great story of a teenage boy who has an immune deficiency, and then he's living trapped in there, keeping him in this sterile bubble in his house. But then the girl next door starts to come over to visit him, and then they fall in love. And she's outside the bubble, and he's inside, and finally they can't take it anymore, so she climbs in, and then it becomes their space. It's kind of like that. But my point is that bubbles are very fragile. And Jesus talks about the problem of adultery. Now, we all know that adultery will ruin a relationship. But then he talks about lust. And he says something as small as lust, you think it's not a big deal, that also can ruin a marriage. And whether you're married or single, I want you to understand this, that God, they're finding and discovering, has hardwired us for purity and for holiness. Maybe you've never heard that. There have been studies done with people who sleep around, whether they're single or married, but the studies have been done on people who sleep around. And they've asked them the question in one study, how do you feel after you've slept with someone that you just met? And here are some of the words that people in the study used to describe how they felt. Regret, used, guilty, empty, ashamed, lonely, degraded, abused, and dirty. Now, here's the thing. And some of them even said, I felt like I need a shower. Some said, I feel a sense of shame for months. Now, here's the thing. That you know that there's something wrong if something God created, sex, to be good and beautiful in marriage, that when it happens, you feel dirty. You know something is not going right. And now psychologists are beginning to explain it like this. They say that when you become intimate with someone, when you start to bond with another person and spend time with them, that your brain releases a neurochemical called oxytocin. And oxytocin tells your body that you're bonding with this one person. But then when a person steps outside of their marriage and is intimate with someone else, or someone who is single begins to sleep around, the brain gets confused. And all of this cognitive disequilibration starts to confuse the brain. Like, who is this person that all of a sudden you want me to bond with, but I hardly know them? And it doesn't sit right with us. And so we have these feelings of confusion, and people describe it as feeling dirty or ashamed. And Jesus says the trouble isn't just with the big things like adultery. He says something as small as lust can get into a marriage and affect it. And you think it's so small, and it doesn't, but it will affect not just your relationship with someone you love, it will affect your relationship with God, even the small things. And so I want to give you this challenge next. Keep the space between airtight and protect it. So let's go back to our text, and we read this, verse 29. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, we read this and we go, man, Jesus is pretty aggressive here. But I want to say, no, it's a figure of speech. And what he's not saying literally cut off a limb of your body or poke out your eye. He is saying, get rid of the things, cut out the things that are breaching, invading this airtight space that God has given you and someone else. This space between is intimate and it's exclusive. And it's just for two people. There's some things that no one else should experience that just the two of you experience. Because whatever comes into this space will have an effect on it. You need to be very aware. So be very careful of what you allow in. They will corrupt it. I think some of the things that corrupt this space, for example, are other people. It could be people from past relationships. People who find you on Facebook, be very careful. It can be things like pornography, or it could be an addiction. It could be alcohol. It could be work. Work is innocuous, but sometimes that work will enter into that space and start to crowd it out. It could be friends who don't have boundaries. It could be parents who don't have boundaries. And Jesus then calls out the one thing that can really corrupt things is this idea of lust. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but he says it is. We read this problem of lust and temptation all the way back in the first pages of the Bible, going all the way back to Eden. So you have Eve, and she sees some fruit, and this fruit makes a promise that it can give her something that she desires. And so I'm just picturing the situation. I think she walks past the fruit and around the fruit several times. But we are sensory beings, and fruit has a smell, it has a color, it has a taste. And so she's drawn to it, and she's like going down the produce aisle, and finally she touches it maybe, and then she pulls it off the tree, and then she eats it. And the truth is, all of us face that kind of temptation. We are all sensory beings. For example, many of you here, about 85%, including me, struggle with an addiction called caffeine. And a lot of you, I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands, but a lot of us need our caffeine fix in the morning. Now, what you don't want usually is just a cup of coffee, but there's an experience that comes with coffee that some of you crave. Maybe you don't even know this. You can make coffee at home, but for some reason, when you go to a coffee shop, doesn't it taste better? Because you walk in and there's this experience. You can hear the coffee grinder. You can smell the aroma of the beans that have been ground. And then the barista asks you for your order and wants your name to put it on the cup, and you give her this complicated order it would take a chemist to make, like a caramel macchiato, frap, double express, triple whip, extra hot. I don't know, whatever you order, but you order that, and then they call out your name. And then you really just need to hold that to feel better, don't you? You don't take a sip right away. It's not the caffeine you're always after. Often it's the experience, because we're sensory beings. Now, there's some of you that are past the experience. You just need the fix. I was in Liberia with some guys from the Grove. We're in Ganta. I'm going to name it the dirtiest city in the world. Anyway, we're in Ganta. There's no hot water when we wake up in the morning. So I see one of the guys, John. He has a 2-liter bottle with about this much water in it. And then I see him tear open like 4 Vias, and he's putting them in this lukewarm room temperature water, and he's shaking it. And I say, John, what on the earth are you doing right now? He says, I'm making coffee. And I says, no, you're not going to drink that. And he starts to chug it. He says, addiction is a really sad thing, isn't it? You know, it's a really sick thing. And he did that almost every day we're there when he couldn't get hot water. Most of us need the experience along with it. Some just need the fix. But the problem in Eden is that the temptation, the lust, it leads to rebellion. God offers a good, beautiful life, and then she takes something else. It's a rebellion against God. The thing with any lust, any temptation, is that lust is a liar. It will promise you something like the fruit, and it can never deliver. It's supposed to fill the hole in your soul, and it doesn't. In verse 28, we read this: your heart can be corrupted by lust. The Greek words that is used here for lust is epithumos, which is a compound word. It's 2 words put together. Epi is the mind. And epi is in, and thumos is the mind, in the mind. When something gets in your mind and you start to think about it, and you start to use Jesus' words, lust for it or long for it, it sucks you in and it takes over your behavior, and you make the worst decisions possible. And you become almost a slave to this thing. What we really crave, I think, in life are not the things we lust over. The thing that we really want in our heart is someone to love us, someone who we can love. And the Bible and God, they call this marriage, and that's why God has designed this space between, and it's sacred and it's holy. And that's what I want to remind you of next, that this space between two people is sacred and holy. Here's how we read about this space in Hebrews chapter 13. Honor marriage and guard the sacredness of sexual intimacy between husband and wife, between wife and husband. Aren't those powerful words? Honor marriage and guard the sacredness of sexual intimacy. It doesn't matter if you're married or single. keep yourself holy. Keep yourself holy because of your relationship with God. Keep yourself holy because of the person who you are married to or one day you may choose to marry. But guard that sacredness. Marriage, I'm convinced, is something that God has given us as a gift. Not just to make us more happy, but I think to draw us into his holiness. But I'm convinced that God is present in marriage because every person on planet Earth, all of us, we love going to a wedding ceremony. And you see the bride enter the room at the back, and she starts to come down the aisle, and it hits you something special, something sacred is happening because this woman is giving her life to this one man. Of all the billions of people on earth, this one man, she's giving her life to this one person. And it's something that's special. I think that's why we all love wedding proposals as well. Last month, my family was in San Diego because my son Christian was graduating from Point Loma. At the same time, the same hour, his girlfriend, who he's known since high school here and from the Grove, Morgan, she was graduating from San Diego Christian University. So they couldn't go to each other's graduation. So afterwards, we agreed to meet for a late lunch in La Jolla. And so after the graduations, we go to Caroline's in La Jolla. If you haven't been there, it's stunning. It sits on a cliff overlooking the Pacific. And then I didn't know this. I didn't hardly have breakfast that morning. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they're still serving breakfast. So just a side note, I ordered the French toast with the strawberries and the whipped cream and the powdered sugar. And it's A+, so top shelf. So we all are eating a late afternoon breakfast. And then someone says, and it's just a great day. We've had the graduation, and now we're there with family and friends. And then someone says, let's go down on the beach and take some pictures. And we go down on the beach, and they're taking pictures. And then all of a sudden, I see my son Christian drop down on one knee. And then I hear him say to Morgan, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? And she says yes. And in that moment, with her family watching and his family and even his grandparents, my parents are there, you know in that moment something very divine and sacred is happening. And it was one of those magical days that you don't want to end. And the day just continued to be magical because later for dinner, all of us went out to celebrate at my favorite place in San Diego, Wahoo's Fish Tacos. And while we're having Wahoo's Fish Tacos, the Dodgers and the Padres were playing. And it got even better because just a few days before we got to San Diego, Jennifer and Clay Bellinger. Jennifer is our children's ministry pastor at the Grove. Her son, Cody, got called up from the minors to the majors. And he's on TV, and we're eating fish tacos watching Cody. And then he comes up to bat, and the bases are loaded, and Cody hits a grand slam. I'm not making this up. That's the kind of day it was. Couldn't get any better. And we're going to applaud that. And maybe it's just God saying something sacred, something divine is happening here. I think what you realize in marriage is, and when you come together in this sacred space, is the presence of God is there. And sure, God is present with all of us all the time, but I think something about marriage reminds us of the presence of God and draws us closer to him and causes us to be people that are increasingly holy. And so can I leave you with this challenge, and it's this: fight for, protect, treasure the space between. Strengthen it. And in Mark chapter 10, Jesus says this. So in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about the pain of divorce and the problem of divorce. And then in Mark chapter 10, he kind of expands and expounds on this idea. Verse 4, some religious leaders say to him, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. And then Jesus answers, it was because of your hearts were hard that Moses wrote this law. Jesus replied, at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. They are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. You see, Jesus was saying this because in this moment in time in first century Israel, divorce was happening too easily. All you needed was a legal document, a simple document to give to the rabbi, and you could walk away from your spouse. And Jesus is saying, no, it's not that easy. Fight for it. Hold on to it. He says, no one separate it. Grab onto it and fight for your marriage. Jesus really talks in both the Sermon on the Mount and in this passage, he talks about the pain of divorce and what it feels like. And I think probably all of us in the room, we've watched marriages unravel. Maybe you've watched a coworker or a neighbor or a brother, a sister, a mother, a father, a son, or a daughter. You've watched the wedding rings come off. You've watched the houses go up for sale. You've seen the marriages split, and it really hurts. And if you've been through divorce, I'm sorry. I think it's one of the most difficult, hardest things that we go through in life, and I'm sorry. And for that reason, that's why Jesus says here, fight for your marriage, guard it, protect it. And when we talk about the challenge of marriage, I want to leave you with this thought, and these two simple challenges. Sometimes I hear people talk about working at their marriage. And that's a good verb. I think there's better verbs than work at it, because sometimes I hear people talk about marriage like it's drudgery, like it's just boring and it's overwhelming. And it's supposed to be exciting. Can I say this? My first challenge is create an adventure together. Go on an adventure with your spouse. And if you're not married, and if one day you want to be, then start praying to God. Say, don't just ask God for someone to keep you company. Pray that God gives you someone you can go on an adventure with. I think that's what everyone needs to realize in their marriage. And then because sometimes marriages can devolve into just getting things done. Taxes, taking kids to soccer practice and cheer practice, Home Depot, Target, TV, mow the lawn, but it's so much more than that. So ask God for that in your marriage, because when you go on an adventure with someone who you love, all of a sudden you're serving together and you're creating together and you're living generously and dangerously and changing lives. And then can I challenge you with this, that in this space between, find the purpose that God has for you and your husband or your wife in it. We all know as Christians that God has given us individual purpose. But I think when you step into this space with another person who God has brought you together with, that you have a divine purpose together. And maybe you've never found that. Maybe you're not serving together. Maybe you haven't gone on an adventure for God together. And I want to say that it's time.